What if doing the right thing cost you everything you worked for? What if saving a life meant losing your career, your reputation, and everything you believed about justice? Sometimes the most heroic acts come with the highest price, and sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who betray us. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a 26-year-old emergency room nurse whose split-second decision to save a wounded Navy SEAL's life would unravel a web of corruption so deep that it reached the highest levels of military command. Her act of courage didn't just save one man's life, it exposed a conspiracy that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. But in a world where doing what's right can make you the enemy, Sarah would discover that the real battle wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was fought in hospital corridors, military tribunals, and the shadows of a system designed to protect those who serve, till someone threatens to expose the truth. This is her story. A story of courage, betrayal, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital's emergency room buzzed with their usual harsh intensity as Sarah Mitchell checked the clock on the wall. 2:15 in the morning, and the night shift was proving to be unusually quiet for a Friday. She had been working as an emergency room nurse for 3 years now, ever since graduating from nursing school with honors, and she had learned to appreciate these rare moments of calm. They never lasted long. Sarah was organizing medical supplies in the trauma bay when her colleague, Janet Rodriguez, approached with a concerned expression. Janet had been working at Mercy General for over 15 years and had seen everything the emergency room could throw at them. When Janet looked worried, it usually meant something serious was coming their way. "Sarah, we just got word from dispatch," Janet said, lowering her voice despite the relative quiet of the ER. "There's an incoming trauma case. Military transport is bringing in a wounded serviceman. ETA is about 10 minutes. Sarah nodded, immediately shifting into a professional mode. Military cases weren't uncommon at Mercy General, given their proximity to the naval base, but they always carried an extra weight of responsibility. These were men and women who had put their lives on the line for their country, and Sarah felt a personal obligation to give them the best care possible. "What are we looking at?" Sarah asked as she began preparing the trauma bay, checking that all the necessary equipment was in working order. "Details are sketchy," Janet replied, helping to arrange the medical instruments. "Gunshot wound to the chest, possible internal bleeding. The transport medic said he's lost a lot of blood, but he's stable for now. Dr. Marcus Webb, the attending physician on duty, joined them as they prepared. Dr. Webb was a seasoned emergency medicine doctor in his early 50s, with greying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many late nights. He was known for his steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure, qualities that had earned him the respect of the entire ER staff. "I just spoke with the transport team," Dr. Webb said, pulling on his gloves. "The patient is a Navy SEAL, part of a classified operation. We won't get many details about how this happened, but we need to be ready for anything." The military liaison officer is en route as well. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for, the moments when her skills and dedication could make the difference between life and death. She had always been drawn to emergency medicine because of the immediate impact she could have on people's lives. There was no time for second-guessing, no room for hesitation. Every decision mattered. The ambulance doors burst open, and the paramedics rushed in with their patient. Sarah's first glimpse of the wounded SEAL struck her immediately. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with short dark hair and a strong jawline. Even though his face was pale from blood loss, his military uniform was torn and blood-stained, and she could see the makeshift bandages that the field medics had applied to his chest wound. "Patient's name is Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson," the lead paramedic called out as they transferred him to the hospital gurney. "Single gunshot wound to the right chest, entry point approximately 2 inches below the clavicle. Vital signs have been stable during transport, but he's lost significant blood. We've got 2 IVs running, with normal saline." Dr. Webb immediately took charge, conducting his initial assessment while Sarah and Janet worked to connect the patient to the hospital's monitoring equipment. Sarah noted that despite his obvious pain and blood loss, Lieutenant Commander Thompson remained conscious and alert, his eyes focused and determined. She had seen that look before in military patients, the refusal to give in to weakness, even in the face of serious injury. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, can you hear me?" Dr. Webb asked as he examined the wound. "I'm Dr. Webb, and we're going to take good care of you." The SEAL's voice was weak but clear when he responded. "Roger that, Doc. How bad is it?" "We're still assessing, but you're in good hands, Doctor," Webb replied, his tone professional but reassuring. Sarah appreciated how Dr. Rush's appreciation. Welcome. Catherine Cheer," Day tomorrow. I felt a pleasure to receive a child, and once a month later a band of communications said, "Cheer, cheer, welcome, welcome to none," Webb replied, his tone professional but reassuring. "Cheer, day tomorrow. I felt a pleasure to receive a child. Welcome to us today." Webb always managed to project confidence and competence without making promises he couldn't keep. As the medical team worked, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The wound pattern didn't quite look like what she would expect from a typical combat injury. She had seen numerous gunshot wounds during her time in the ER, and something about this one seemed different. The entry point was clean and precise, more consistent with a close-range shot than something that might occur during a firefight. But there wasn't time to dwell on her observations. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's blood pressure was dropping, and Dr. Webb ordered immediate blood work and chest x-rays. Sarah quickly drew blood samples while Janet prepared the portable x-ray machine. "Sarah, we need to get him to surgery," Dr. Webb said after reviewing the initial x-rays. "The bullet appears to have nicked a major blood vessel. He's bleeding internally, and we need to stop it now." As they prepared to move Lieutenant Commander Thompson to the surgical suite, Sarah noticed two men in military uniforms entering the emergency room. One was clearly a high-ranking officer, based on his insignia, while the other appeared to be some kind of military police or security personnel. They approached the nursing station and began speaking in hushed tones with the charge nurse. The older officer, who Sarah would later learn was Colonel Marcus Hartwell, had an imposing presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with steel grey hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His uniform was impeccable, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Excuse me," Colonel Hartwell said, approaching Dr. Webb as they prepared to move the patient. "I'm Colonel Hartwell, and I need to speak with you about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's treatment." Dr. Webb paused, clearly not pleased with the interruption. "Colonel, we need to get this man to surgery immediately. He has internal bleeding that requires urgent attention." "I understand the medical urgency, Doctor," Colonel Hartwell replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "However, there are certain protocols that must be followed. This incident involves classified military operations, and there are specific procedures we need to implement." Sarah watched the exchange with growing unease. She had worked with military patients before, and while there were always certain confidentiality requirements, she had never seen a military officer attempt to interfere with immediate medical care. "Colonel, with all due respect," Dr. Webb said, his voice firm, "my patient's life takes priority over any protocol. We can discuss procedures after we've stabilized him." Lieutenant Commander Thompson, despite his weakened condition, seemed to be following the conversation. Sarah noticed his eyes moving between Dr. Webb and Colonel Hartwell, and she thought she detected a flicker of concern in his expression. "Doctor, I'm not questioning your medical judgment," Colonel Hartwell continued. "I'm simply informing you that this case has certain complications. We'll need to limit access to the patient and ensure that all medical records are handled through appropriate military channels." Dr. Webb looked like he was about to argue further when Lieutenant Commander Thompson's vital signs suddenly took a turn for the worse. His blood pressure dropped dramatically, and the heart monitor began showing irregularities. "We're losing him," Sarah called out, immediately focusing all her attention on the patient. The political discussion would have to wait. A man's life was hanging in the balance. Webb quickly ordered additional medications and fluids while Sarah worked to stabilize the lieutenant commander's vital signs. For several tense minutes it was unclear whether they would be able to maintain his condition long enough to get him to surgery. During those critical moments, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She noticed that one of the IV lines wasn't flowing properly, potentially limiting the amount of life-saving fluids reaching the patient. Without hesitation, she adjusted the line and increased the flow rate, a decision that was technically outside her standing orders, but one that her experience told her was necessary. The adjustment worked. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's vital signs stabilized enough for them to safely transport him to surgery. As they rushed toward the elevator, Sarah caught a glimpse of Colonel Hartwell watching her intently, as if he had noticed her unauthorized intervention. In the elevator, Dr. Webb placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Good catch with that IV line," he said quietly. "You may have just saved his life." Sarah felt a moment of professional satisfaction, but it was tempered by a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right about the entire situation. The wound pattern, Colonel Hartwell's unusual behavior, and the vague details about how Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been injured all combined to create a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours, during which time Sarah completed her shift and prepared to head home. She had stayed late to check on Lieutenant Commander Thompson's condition, partly out of professional concern, and partly because she couldn't stop thinking about the strange circumstances surrounding his case. Dr. Webb emerged from surgery looking exhausted but satisfied. "He's going to make it," he told Sarah. "The bullet did significant damage, but we were able to repair the blood vessel and remove all the foreign material. He'll need extensive recovery time, but he should make a full recovery." As Sarah gathered her things to leave, she noticed that the military personnel were still present in the hospital, having apparently maintained a presence throughout the night. Colonel Hartwell was nowhere to be seen, but several other military personnel were stationed near the intensive care unit where Lieutenant Commander Thompson was recovering. Walking to her car in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah reflected on the night's events. She had been a nurse long enough to develop good instincts about her patients and the situations she encountered. Something about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's case didn't add up, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she had become involved in something much larger and more complex than a simple combat injury. As she drove home through the quiet streets, Sarah made a mental note to check on Lieutenant Commander Thompson's condition when she returned for her next shift. She wanted to make sure he was recovering properly, but she also found herself curious about the mysterious circumstances that had brought him to her emergency room. What Sarah didn't know was that her actions that night had already set in motion a series of events that would threaten not only her career, but her life. The decision to adjust that IV line, made instinctively in the heat of the moment to save a patient's life, had been observed and noted by people who had very different priorities than patient care. In the days that followed, Sarah would discover that sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences that no one could anticipate, and that the people she trusted most might not be who they appeared to be. 3 days after Lieutenant Commander Thompson's emergency surgery, Sarah returned to work for her regularly scheduled shift. The events of that night had stayed with her, and she found herself eager to check on her patient's recovery. As she walked through the hospital corridors toward the intensive care unit, she noticed an unusual amount of security presence that hadn't been there during her previous shifts. 2 military personnel were stationed outside the ICU, and Sarah recognized one of them as the security officer who had accompanied Colonel Hartwell on the night of the incident. When she approached the nurse's station to check on Lieutenant Commander Thompson's condition, she was met by Linda Harrison, the ICU charge nurse, who had a troubled expression on her face. "Sarah, I'm glad you're here," Linda said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard.
"We need to talk about your patient from the other night. Lieutenant Commander Thompson?"
"How is he recovering?" Sarah asked, though she could tell from Linda's tone that something was wrong. "That's just it," Linda replied, lowering her voice further. "There have been some very unusual developments. Yesterday morning, a team of military investigators arrived and spent several hours questioning the entire medical staff who were involved in his care." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Investigators? What kind of questions were they asking? They wanted to know everything about his treatment, who had access to his medical records, and specifically about any procedures that weren't explicitly ordered by the attending physician, Linda explained. "Sarah, they seem particularly interested in you." The implications of Linda's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had saved Lieutenant Commander Thompson's life by making a critical adjustment to his IV line, and now it seemed that action was being scrutinized, as if it was somehow suspicious.
"Did they say what this was about?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing anxiety she felt.
"They claimed it was routine protocol for classified military cases," Linda said. "But I've been working here for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this." They also requested copies of all security footage from the emergency room during the time Lieutenant Commander Thompson was being treated. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information. Security footage would show her adjusting the IV line without specific authorization, an action that was medically appropriate but technically outside standard protocol. In normal circumstances, this wouldn't be an issue. Nurses made such decisions regularly based on their clinical judgment, but clearly these weren't normal circumstances. "Where is Lieutenant Commander Thompson now?" Sarah asked. "He was transferred to a private room on the 7th floor yesterday," Linda replied. "But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. The military has restricted access to him. No hospital staff are allowed to visit unless specifically requested by the military medical team." This news troubled Sarah even more. Patient isolation wasn't uncommon in certain medical situations, but the military's level of control over Lieutenant Commander Thompson's care seemed excessive. As a professional, she felt responsible for following up on patients she had treated, and the restriction felt like an unwarranted interference with proper medical care. Sarah decided to speak with Dr. Comback Serv Webb about the situation. She found him in the emergency room reviewing patient charts, and he looked up with a weary expression when she approached. "Sarah, I was hoping to talk with you," Dr. Webb said, setting down his chart. "We need to discuss what happened the other night." "Dr. Webb, I know I adjusted the IV flow rate without a direct order, but the patient's condition was deteriorating, and I felt it was medically necessary," Sarah began. "But Dr." Webb held up a hand to stop her. "Sarah, you did exactly what any competent nurse should have done in that situation, Dr. Marquand," Webb said firmly. "Your clinical judgment was sound, and your actions likely saved that man's life. That's not what I'm concerned about." "Then what is it?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I've been contacted by hospital administration," Dr. Webb explained. "They've received a formal complaint from the military regarding your conduct during Lieutenant Commander Thompson's treatment. They're claiming that you exceeded your authority and potentially compromised patient care." Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "That's absurd. I improved patient care." "You said so yourself." "I know, and I've documented my support for your actions in my report, Doctor," Webb said. "But the military is pushing for a formal disciplinary review. They're also requesting that you be removed from any future cases involving military personnel." The injustice of the situation was overwhelming. Sarah had dedicated her career to helping people, and now she was being punished for doing exactly that. She couldn't understand why the military would target her for actions that had clearly benefited their soldier. "Dr. Webb, there's something strange about this whole situation," Sarah said, deciding to voice her concerns. "The wound pattern didn't look like a typical combat injury, and the military's behavior has been unusual from the beginning." Dr. Webb's expression grew more serious.
"Sarah, I've been thinking the same thing, but we need to be very careful here. If there's something more going on, getting involved could put us both at risk."
Before Sarah could respond, her pager buzzed with an urgent message to report to the hospital administrator's office immediately.
Dr. Webb saw her check the message and gave her a concerned look. "Good luck," he said quietly. "Remember, you did nothing wrong." The walk to the administrator's office felt like the longest journey of Sarah's career. Margaret Sinclair, the hospital administrator, was known for being tough but fair, and Sarah hoped she would be able to explain her actions and clear up any misunderstanding. However, when Sarah entered the office, she found that Mrs. Sinclair wasn't alone. Colonel Hartwell was seated across from the administrator's desk, and he looked up at Sarah with an expression that was difficult to read. "Please sit down, Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Dan," Sinclair said, her tone formal and slightly cold. "We need to discuss some serious concerns that have been raised about your conduct." Sarah took a seat, acutely aware that this meeting could determine the future of her career. She had always prided herself on her professionalism and competence, and the idea that her actions were being questioned felt like a personal attack. "Miss Pease, Mitchell," Colonel Hartwell began. "During Lieutenant Commander Thompson's treatment, you made several decisions that were outside your authorized scope of practice. Specifically, you altered his IV medication flow rate without physician orders, potentially putting the patient at risk. Sir, with all due respect, I made those adjustments based on my clinical assessment of the patient's condition," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "The patient's vital signs were deteriorating, and the IV line was not functioning properly. My actions improved his condition and likely prevented further complications." "That may be your assessment," Ms. said. "Mitchell," Colonel Hartwell continued, "but you exceeded your authority. In military medical situations, strict protocols must be followed to ensure proper care and maintain security procedures." Mrs. Sinclair consulted a file on her desk before speaking. "Miss Mitchell, I have here a formal complaint alleging that your unauthorized actions potentially compromised patient safety and violated hospital protocols." "This is a very serious matter." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Mrs. Sinclair, Dr. Economy, Webb was present during the entire treatment and supported my actions. The patient recovered successfully because of the care he received. Dr. Webb's support is noted." "Mrs. Sinclair replied, "But the complaint has been filed by military medical authorities who have oversight of this case. I'm afraid I have to inform you that pending a full investigation, you're being placed on administrative leave." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Administrative leave was essentially a suspension, removing her from patient care while the investigation proceeded. Lovell, for a nurse, it was a serious disciplinary action that could permanently damage her career prospects.
"This is unfair," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite her shock.
"I saved that man's life and now I'm being punished for it." "Miss Mitchell, I understand your frustration," Mrs. Sinclair said, "but this decision has been made. You'll receive notification of the investigation process, and your rights regarding representation. Until this matter is resolved, you're prohibited from entering patient care areas of the hospital. Colonel Hartwell stood to leave, pausing only to address Sarah directly.
Miss Rains.
Mitchell, I hope you understand that military operations require absolute adherence to proper procedures. Sometimes individual initiative, however well-intentioned, can have consequences that extend far beyond what civilians might understand. After Colonel Hartwell left, Mrs. Sinclair's expression softened slightly. Sarah, off the record, I want you to know that your personnel file shows an exemplary record. This situation is unusual, and I hope it can be resolved quickly. Mrs. Sinclair, can you tell me what this is really about? Sarah asked. This doesn't feel like a routine disciplinary matter. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss the details of the investigation, Mrs. W. Sinclair replied. What I can tell you is that you should consider obtaining legal representation.
This matter may be more complex than a simple hospital disciplinary procedure.
As Sarah left the administrator's office, her mind was reeling with the implications of what had just happened.
In less than a week, she had gone from being a respected emergency room nurse to someone under investigation for actions that should have earned her commendation, not discipline.
Walking through the hospital corridors that had been her professional home for 3 years, Sarah felt like a stranger.
The security personnel posted near the ICU watched her as she passed, and she wondered if they had been told to monitor her movements. Outside in the parking garage, Sarah sat in her car trying to process what had happened. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Thompson and wondered about his condition. She also thought about the strange wound pattern she had observed, and Colonel Hartwell's unusual behavior throughout the entire incident. The more she considered the situation, the more convinced she became that Lieutenant Commander Thompson's injury wasn't the result of a typical military operation. The precision of the wound, the immediate involvement of high-ranking military officials, and now the aggressive response to her medical care all suggested that something more significant was at play. Sarah realized she needed help understanding what she had become involved in. She decided to contact her friend Jessica Chen, an investigative journalist who had covered military affairs for several years. If anyone could help her make sense of the situation, it would be Jessica. As she drove home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a dramatic turn. She had always believed that doing the right thing would protect her, but now she was learning that sometimes the right thing could make you a target. What Sarah didn't know was that her instincts were correct, and that Lieutenant Commander Thompson's case was connected to something much larger than a simple training accident. She also didn't know that her decision to reach out for help would soon put her in even greater danger, as there were people who would go to great lengths to keep certain secrets buried. 2 weeks into her forced administrative leave, Sarah found herself sitting across from Jessica Chen at a quiet corner table in a downtown coffee shop. Jessica was a seasoned investigative journalist in her early 30s, with sharp intelligence and an instinct for uncovering stories that others missed. The two had been friends since college, and Sarah knew she could trust Jessica to help her understand what was happening. "This whole situation stinks, Sarah," Jessica said, after hearing the complete account of Lieutenant Commander Thompson's treatment and the subsequent investigation. Military personnel don't usually get this involved in routine medical care, even for classified operations. Sarah appreciated having someone believe her instincts about the case. The isolation of her suspension had left her questioning her own judgment, despite knowing that her actions had been medically appropriate. "What really bothers me is the wound pattern," Sarah explained. "I've treated enough gunshot victims to recognize the difference between a combat injury and something else. This looked more like a close-range, deliberate shooting." Jessica leaned forward, her journalistic instincts clearly engaged. "Sarah, what if Lieutenant Commander Thompson wasn't injured in combat? What if he was shot by someone in his own unit, or during some kind of incident that the military doesn't want investigated?" The possibility had occurred to Sarah, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real and more frightening. If Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been the victim of friendly fire, or worse, it would explain the military's unusual behavior and their eagerness to control the narrative around his treatment.
"But why target me?" Sarah asked.
"I just provided medical care." "Because you observed things they don't want documented," Jessica replied. "Your clinical notes about the wound pattern, your presence during his treatment, your ability to testify about his condition. All of that makes you a potential witness to something they want kept quiet." Jessica pulled out her laptop and began making notes. "I'm going to do some research on Lieutenant Commander Thompson and see what I can find out about his unit and recent operations. In the meantime, you need to be very careful about who you talk to and what you say. Jessica, I'm scared. Sarah admitted. I became a nurse to help people, and now it feels like my whole career is being destroyed because I did my job. We're going to figure this out, Jessica assured her. But you need to understand that if my suspicions are correct, you may have stumbled into something much bigger than a medical malpractice case. Over the following days, Jessica began her investigation, while Sarah tried to navigate the formal disciplinary process. She had hired an attorney, David Kim, who specialized in healthcare law and employee rights. David was a soft-spoken man in his 40s with extensive experience defending medical professionals against unfair disciplinary actions. Sarah, I've reviewed your case file, and from a purely medical standpoint, you have a strong defense, David explained during their first meeting. Your actions were clinically appropriate, and Dr. Webb's support carries significant weight. But, Sarah asked, sensing there was more, but the military's involvement changes the dynamic significantly, David continued. They're claiming that security protocols were violated, not just medical protocols. This could move beyond hospital disciplinary procedures into federal jurisdiction. The possibility of federal involvement was terrifying to Sarah. She had never imagined that saving a patient's life could lead to such serious consequences. Meanwhile, Jessica's investigation was uncovering disturbing information about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's unit. Through her military contacts and public records research, she discovered that his team had been involved in several classified operations over the past year, some of which had resulted in congressional oversight hearings behind closed doors. Sarah, I think Lieutenant Commander Thompson may have been a whistleblower, Jessica revealed during one of their meetings. I found records showing that he had requested meetings with the Inspector General's office in the weeks before his injury. That's usually a sign that someone is reporting misconduct or illegal activities. This revelation added a whole new dimension to the situation. If Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been preparing to expose wrongdoing within his unit, his shooting could have been an attempt to silence him permanently. We need to find a way to talk to him, Sarah said. If he's really a whistleblower, he needs to know that his medical treatment is being used to discredit potential witnesses. That's going to be nearly impossible, Jessica replied. I've checked and he's been transferred to a military medical facility. Access is completely controlled by the military. However, Jessica's journalistic connections provided an unexpected breakthrough. One of her sources at the Pentagon reached out with information about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's case that changed everything they thought they knew. Sarah, you need to sit down for this, Jessica said when she called with the news. Lieutenant Commander Thompson wasn't just a whistleblower. He was working with federal investigators to expose a weapons trafficking operation involving members of his own command structure. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. According to Jessica's source, Lieutenant Commander Thompson had discovered that senior officers in his unit were selling military weapons and equipment to private contractors, who were then reselling them to foreign buyers. The profits were being used to fund unauthorized operations that were kept secret from congressional oversight. He was shot by someone in his own unit to prevent him from testifying before a federal grand jury, Jessica continued. The whole combat injury story was fabricated to cover up an attempted murder. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had uncovered. She had saved the life of a man who was trying to expose high-level military corruption, and now those same corrupt officials were using her medical care as a weapon against him. Jessica, what do we do with this information? Sarah asked. I'm just a nurse caught in the middle of something I never asked to be part of. We need to get this information to the right people, Jessica replied. But we also need to be extremely careful. If these people were willing to shoot one of their own soldiers, they won't hesitate to target us. David Kim's legal expertise became crucial as they navigated the complex legal landscape surrounding the case. He explained that Sarah's situation was now potentially covered by federal whistleblower protection laws, since she had inadvertently become a witness to evidence of federal crimes. Sarah, the good news is that if you're willing to cooperate with federal investigators, you'll have significant legal protections, David explained. The bad news is that those protections only work if the investigators are clean. If there's corruption within the investigative agencies, you could still be at risk. The decision to come forward with their information was difficult and frightening, but Sarah knew it was the right thing to do. She had become a nurse to help people and uphold ethical standards, and she couldn't remain silent about corruption that was putting soldiers' lives at risk. Jessica arranged a meeting with Agent Maria Santos, a federal investigator from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, who was known for her integrity and independence. Agent Santos was a seasoned investigator in her late 40s with a reputation for pursuing cases regardless of political pressure. The meeting took place in a secure federal building, and Sarah felt nervous as she prepared to tell her story to federal investigators. She knew that once she crossed this line, there would be no going back to her quiet life as a hospital nurse.
Mitchell, we appreciate your willingness to come forward, Agent Santos said as the interview began. We understand that this situation has been difficult for you, but your observations may be crucial to our investigation. Sarah recounted everything she had observed during Lieutenant Commander Thompson's treatment, including the unusual wound pattern and Colonel Hartwell's strange behavior. She also provided copies of her clinical notes and any other documentation she had retained from that night.
Ms. Mitchell, your medical observations support other evidence we've gathered about this case, Agent Santos explained. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was indeed working with federal investigators when he was shot. The people responsible for his shooting are now trying to use the investigation of your medical care to discredit him as a witness.
What can I do to help? Sarah asked.
We need you to testify before a federal grand jury about your observations, Agent Santos replied. Your medical expertise and first-hand account of Lieutenant Commander Thompson's condition will help us prove that his injuries were consistent with an assassination attempt, not a combat accident. The prospect of testifying before a grand jury was intimidating, but Sarah knew it was the right thing to do. Lieutenant Commander Thompson had risked his life to expose corruption, and she owed it to him to help ensure that justice was served. However, Agent Santos also provided a sobering warning about the risks Sarah would face. Ms. Mitchell, you need to understand that the people involved in this conspiracy have significant resources and connections, Agent Santos said. They've already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. We can provide some protection, but you'll need to be very careful about your personal security. As Sarah left the federal building that day, she realized that her life had been permanently changed by the events of that night in the emergency room. She was no longer just a nurse who had saved a patient's life. She was now a key witness in a federal investigation that could bring down high-ranking military officials. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Sarah also felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She was fighting not just for her own career and reputation, but for the principles of justice and integrity that had drawn her to healthcare in the first place. What Sarah didn't know was that her decision to cooperate with federal investigators had already been noted by the very people she was helping to investigate. Colonel Hartwell and his associates were preparing to take more aggressive action to protect their conspiracy, and Sarah had just moved to the top of their list of problems that needed to be eliminated. 3 days after her meeting with federal investigators, Sarah's world became even more dangerous. She was at home reviewing legal documents when her doorbell rang unexpectedly. Looking through the peephole, she saw a man in a delivery uniform holding a package, but something about his posture and the way he kept looking around made her suspicious. "I'm sorry, I'm not expecting any deliveries today," Sarah called through the door without opening it. "Ma'am, this is an urgent delivery for Sarah Mitchell," the man replied. "I need a signature." Sarah's instincts told her something was wrong. She quietly moved away from the door and called Agent Santos from her cell phone. "Agent Santos, I think someone is at my house who shouldn't be," Sarah whispered into the phone. "Don't open the door," Agent Santos replied immediately. "We're sending backup to your location. Can you get to a secure room and stay on the line?" Sarah quickly moved to her bedroom closet, which had a solid door and no windows. As she hid, she could hear the man outside trying the door handle and then moving around to the back of the house. Within minutes, she heard the sound of multiple vehicles arriving and authoritative voices identifying themselves as federal agents. The immediate threat was over, but the message was clear. Someone was actively trying to reach her, and their intentions were unlikely to be good. Agent Santos arrived at Sarah's house an hour later with a full security team. The man who had posed as a delivery driver was nowhere to be found, but the agents discovered evidence that her house had been under surveillance for several days. "Sarah, we found listening devices in your car and signs that someone has been monitoring your communications," Agent Santos explained. "We need to move you to a safe location immediately." The reality of her situation hit Sarah with full force. She was no longer just a witness in a federal investigation. She had become a target of people who were willing to use violence to protect their secrets.
Within hours, Sarah found herself in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, under the protection of federal marshals.
The house was modest but secure, with bulletproof windows and an advanced security system. 2 marshals, Agent Jennifer Walsh and Agent Robert Chen, would be responsible for her protection around the clock. "Miss Mitchell, we know this is a difficult adjustment," Agent Walsh explained as they settled into the safe house. But the people we're dealing with have already attempted to kill Lieutenant Commander Thompson, and they clearly see you as a threat. The isolation of the safe house gave Sarah time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. Just a month ago, her biggest concern had been managing her patient load during busy shifts. Now she was living under federal protection because she had saved a man's life. Jessica Chen was also facing increased scrutiny because of her investigation. When she attempted to contact Sarah through normal channels, she was visited by federal agents who explained the security situation and arranged for secure communication methods. "Sarah, my newspaper is being pressured to kill the story," Jessica reported during one of their secure phone calls.
"I'm getting calls from people claiming to represent military public affairs, saying that publishing this information would harm national security."
"Are you going to back down?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Hell no," Jessica replied. "This story is exactly the kind of corruption that the public needs to know about. But I am being extra careful about my sources and my personal security." Meanwhile, David Kim was fighting the legal battle to clear Sarah's name and restore her nursing license. The hospital had placed her on indefinite suspension pending resolution of the investigation, but David was arguing that the suspension was retaliation for her cooperation with federal authorities. "Sarah, I filed a federal lawsuit claiming that your suspension violates whistleblower protection laws," David explained during a secure video call. "The hospital is now caught between military pressure and federal law. They can't keep you suspended without risking significant legal consequences." However, the legal victory felt hollow to Sarah while she remained in protective custody. She missed her work, her patients, and her normal life. The safe house felt like a prison, even though she understood it was necessary for her protection. Agent Santos provided regular updates on the investigation's progress. Lieutenant Commander Thompson had been moved to a secure medical facility, where he was recovering from his injuries, while providing detailed testimony about the weapons trafficking conspiracy. "Thompson's testimony is devastating," Agent Santos explained. "He has documentation of weapons sales, records of unauthorized operations, and evidence of money laundering through military contractors. But the conspiracy goes higher than we initially thought." The investigation had uncovered evidence that the weapons trafficking operation involved not just Lieutenant Commander Thompson's immediate command, but also officials in the Pentagon and several defense contracting companies. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving millions of dollars and potentially affecting military operations worldwide. "Colonel Hartwell is just a middle manager in this operation," Agent Santos continued. "The real leaders are people with the power to influence federal investigations and military justice proceedings." This revelation explained the sophisticated surveillance and intimidation tactics being used against Sarah. She wasn't just dealing with rogue military officers. She was up against a network of powerful individuals with access to significant resources. During her 4th week in protective custody, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, accompanied by federal agents and still showing signs of his recovery, had requested to meet with her. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally for saving my life," Lieutenant Commander Thompson said when they met in the safe house's secure conference room. Despite his ordeal, he appeared alert and determined. "I was just doing my job," Sarah replied, though she was moved by his gratitude. "No, you went beyond your job," Thompson said. "And because of that, I'm alive to tell the truth about what these people have been doing. Your courage in that emergency room gave me the chance to expose a conspiracy that was putting soldiers' lives at risk." Thompson explained that the weapons trafficking operation had been ongoing for over 2 years, with military equipment being sold to the highest bidder regardless of their intentions or allegiances. Some of the weapons had ended up in the hands of terrorist organizations, potentially leading to American casualties in other operations. "When I started investigating, I thought it was just a few corrupt officers trying to make money," Thompson continued. "But the deeper I dug, the more I realized this was a systematic corruption of military supply chains. They were literally selling weapons that could be used to kill American soldiers." Sarah was horrified by the scope of the conspiracy. She had known her testimony was important, but she hadn't fully understood how many lives were at stake. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, what happened the night you were shot?" Sarah asked. "I had arranged to turn over evidence to federal investigators the next morning," Thompson explained. "But someone in my unit found out about the meeting. Colonel Hartwell ordered me to report for a special briefing, and when I arrived, I realized it was a setup." Thompson described how he had been shot by another member of his unit, Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez, on Colonel Hartwell's orders. They had planned to make it look like he had been killed in a training accident, but Thompson had managed to survive long enough to call for medical assistance.
The irony is that they brought me to the one hospital where I would receive the exact medical care I needed to survive, Thompson said, and they put me in the hands of a nurse who was smart enough to recognize that something wasn't right about the whole situation. The meeting with Lieutenant Commander Thompson reinforced Sarah's commitment to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion.
She understood now that her testimony could help bring justice not just for him, but for all the soldiers who had been betrayed by corrupt officers. However, Agent Santos soon brought disturbing news about the investigation's progress.
Sarah, we've learned that there's going to be an attempt to discredit your testimony, Agent Santos explained. They're planning to argue that your medical observations are unreliable because you were never properly certified to assess gunshot wound patterns. The attack on her credibility was predictable but still frustrating. Sarah knew that her years of emergency room experience had given her expertise that was relevant to the case, but she also understood that legal proceedings often focused on technicalities rather than practical knowledge.
What can we do? Sarah asked.
We're bringing in a ballistics expert and a trauma surgeon to corroborate your observations, Agent Santos replied. But you need to be prepared for aggressive cross-examination when you testify. They're going to try to make you look incompetent or dishonest. The pressure of preparing for testimony while living under protection was taking a psychological toll on Sarah. She had always been a private person who preferred helping people quietly through her work, and the prospect of being the center of a high-profile legal proceeding was intimidating. Jessica Chen's investigative work was providing crucial support for the federal case. Her newspaper had decided to publish a series of articles about military corruption, despite pressure from various official sources. The public attention was helping to protect the witnesses by making it harder for the conspirators to act without scrutiny. Sarah, your story is resonating with people, Jessica reported. Nurses and other healthcare workers are writing letters to the newspaper supporting you. People understand that you were just trying to help a patient, and they're outraged that you're being targeted for doing the right thing. The public support was encouraging, but Sarah knew that the real battle would be fought in federal courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms. The grand jury testimony was scheduled for the following week, and that would be the first major test of whether the evidence against the conspiracy would hold up under legal scrutiny. As Sarah prepared for her testimony, she reflected on how her simple decision to adjust an IV line had led to uncovering a major military corruption scandal. She had never sought to be a hero or a whistleblower, but circumstances had thrust her into a role that could help expose serious wrongdoing. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same clinical instincts that had saved Lieutenant Commander Thompson's life had also led her to recognize the inconsistencies in his case that eventually exposed the conspiracy. Her training as a nurse had prepared her not just to provide medical care, but to observe details and trust her professional judgment, even when others disagreed. What Sarah didn't know was that her upcoming grand jury testimony was seen as the most serious threat yet to the conspiracy. Colonel Hartwell and his associates were preparing a final, desperate attempt to prevent her from testifying, an attempt that would put not just Sarah, but everyone around her in mortal danger. The morning of Sarah's grand jury testimony arrived with an unexpected development that would change everything she thought she knew about her case. Agent Santos arrived at the safe house at dawn with news that would shock everyone involved in the investigation. Sarah, we've arrested Colonel Hartwell and 3 other members of the conspiracy, Agent Santos announced. But we also discovered something that's going to completely change your testimony. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The arrest of Colonel Hartwell meant that the immediate threat to her safety might be reduced, but Agent Santos's tone suggested that new complications had emerged. What did you discover? Sarah asked. Lieutenant Commander Thompson wasn't just investigating the weapons trafficking operation, Agent Santos explained. He was working undercover for us the entire time. He's been a federal agent embedded in the military unit for over a year. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Lieutenant Commander Thompson wasn't just a whistleblowing soldier. He was a federal agent who had been conducting a long-term undercover investigation. Everything she thought she knew about the case suddenly took on new meaning. You mean he's not actually a Navy SEAL? Sarah asked, struggling to process this information. No, he is a SEAL, but he's also a federal agent, Agent Santos clarified. We've been investigating military corruption for years, and Thompson volunteered to go undercover to gather evidence from inside the system. The night he was shot, he was supposed to make contact with his federal handlers to turn over crucial evidence. This explained so many things that had puzzled Sarah about the case. Thompson's calm demeanor under stress, his apparent knowledge of the conspiracy's scope, and even some of the unusual aspects of his medical treatment all made more sense now. But Agent Santos, If Lieutenant Commander Thompson was working for you, why didn't you tell me this earlier? Sarah asked. Because we couldn't compromise his cover until we had arrested the main conspirators. Agent Santos replied, Even now, there are aspects of this operation that remain classified, but Thompson specifically requested that you be told the truth before your testimony. The new information dramatically changed the context of Sarah's testimony, but it also raised new questions about her role in the investigation. If Thompson was a federal agent, then her medical observations and subsequent cooperation had been even more crucial to the success of the operation than she had realized. Later that morning, as Sarah prepared to leave for the federal courthouse, she received another surprise visitor, Mrs. Delirious. Sinclair, the hospital administrator who had suspended her, arrived at the safe house with David Kim and a formal letter. Ms. Mitchell, I'm here to personally apologize and to reinstate you to your position at Mercy General Hospital, Mrs. Sinclair said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. We've learned that the complaints against you were part of a deliberate attempt to discredit a federal witness. The apology felt surreal to Sarah after weeks of suspension and uncertainty about her career. But more important than her personal vindication was the knowledge that the truth about the conspiracy was finally coming to light. Mrs. Carker. Sinclair, I appreciate the apology, but I need to know that the hospital will support other employees who might find themselves in similar situations, Sarah said. Healthcare workers shouldn't be afraid to do the right thing because they might face retaliation.
I agree completely, Mrs.
Sinclair replied. We're implementing new policies to protect staff who report suspected criminal activity or cooperate with law enforcement investigations. At the federal courthouse, Sarah felt nervous but determined as she prepared to testify before the grand jury. The testimony would be given in secret, but she knew that her words could help determine whether the conspirators would face federal charges. However, just as Sarah was entering the courthouse, Agent Santos received urgent communication through her earpiece. Colonel Hartwell, who had been arrested that morning, had just provided information that revealed the most shocking aspect of the entire case. Sarah, we need to talk before you testify, Agent Santos said, pulling her aside into a secure conference room. Colonel Hartwell is claiming that he was also working undercover for a different federal agency, and that the entire weapons trafficking operation was actually an authorized sting operation. The implications of this claim were staggering. If Colonel Hartwell was telling the truth, then the very people Sarah had been helping to investigate might actually have been conducting a legitimate federal operation. Agent Santos, that can't be true, Sarah said. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was shot. That's not part of any legitimate operation. You're absolutely right, and that's what doesn't make sense about Hartwell's story, Agent Santos replied. We're checking his claims, but Thompson is adamant that Hartwell was not working for any federal agency. The confusion surrounding the various claims and counterclaims was overwhelming, but Sarah realized that her role remained the same. She was a medical professional who had observed evidence of attempted murder, regardless of who the perpetrators or victims claimed to be. When Sarah finally testified before the grand jury, she focused on what she knew to be true: her medical observations, Lieutenant Commander Thompson's condition when he arrived at the hospital, and the unusual behavior of military personnel during his treatment. She left the complex questions of federal operations and undercover agents to be sorted out by investigators and prosecutors. Her testimony lasted 3 hours, during which the prosecutors asked detailed questions about wound patterns, medical procedures, and her interactions with military personnel. Sarah answered each question honestly and professionally, drawing on her years of emergency room experience. Miss Mitchell, in your professional opinion, were Lieutenant Commander Thompson's injuries consistent with a combat accident or with a deliberate close-range shooting? The lead prosecutor asked. Based on my experience treating gunshot wounds, the injury pattern was more consistent with a close-range, deliberate shooting, Sarah replied. The wound was too precise, and the angle was wrong for a typical combat situation. After her testimony, Sarah learned that the grand jury had voted to indict Colonel Hartwell and 6 other individuals on charges including attempted murder, weapons trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. Hartwell's claims about being part of a legitimate operation had been investigated and found to be false. The truth about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's status as a federal agent was revealed publicly during the subsequent trials. His undercover work had uncovered a conspiracy involving dozens of military and civilian personnel who had been stealing and selling weapons worth millions of dollars. The trials lasted nearly 8 months, during which Sarah testified twice more as a key prosecution witness. Her medical expertise and credible testimony helped prosecutors prove that Thompson had been the victim of an assassination attempt, not a training accident.
Colonel Hartwell was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for attempted murder and conspiracy. 5 other military personnel received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, while several civilian contractors were also convicted on related charges. But the most shocking revelation came during the final phase of the trials, when prosecutors revealed information that even Sarah hadn't known. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was actually Agent Jake Thompson, a federal investigator who'd been working undercover for over 2 years in multiple military units. Ms. Mitchell, you should know that your quick thinking and medical expertise didn't just save one man's life, Agent Santos explained after the trials concluded. Jake Thompson's investigation led to the exposure of weapons trafficking operations in 4 different military commands. Your actions quite literally helped save countless lives by ensuring he survived to complete his mission. The full scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The investigation revealed that corrupt military personnel had been selling weapons to private contractors who were reselling them to foreign buyers, including some with connections to terrorist organizations. The profits had been used to fund unauthorized operations and personal enrichment for the conspirators. Sarah returned to work at Mercy General Hospital as something of a celebrity among her colleagues. Her case had been covered extensively in the media, and she had become a symbol of healthcare workers who refused to compromise their professional integrity even under pressure. Dr. Webb, who had supported Sarah throughout the ordeal, welcomed her back warmly. Sarah, what you went through was terrible, but you've shown everyone what it means to be a true healthcare professional, he said on her first day back. The hospital had indeed implemented new policies to protect employees who reported suspicious activity or cooperated with law enforcement. Sarah's case had highlighted the importance of supporting healthcare workers who found themselves caught up in criminal investigations through no fault of their own. Jessica Chen's newspaper articles about the case won several journalism awards and helped expose broader patterns of military corruption. Her investigative work had been crucial in supporting the federal investigation and ensuring that the public understood the significance of the conspiracy. Sarah, your story resonated with people because it showed that ordinary citizens can make a difference when they have the courage to do what's right, Jessica told her. You proved that one person's integrity can help expose major corruption and protect countless lives. 6 months after returning to work, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Agent Jake Thompson, the man she had known as Lieutenant Commander Thompson. He had fully recovered from his injuries and was preparing for his next assignment. Miss Mitchell, I wanted to thank you one more time, he said. But I also wanted you to know that your actions that night went far beyond medical care. When you recognized that something wasn't right about my case, you helped ensure that a major investigation could be completed successfully. Sarah was gratified to see Thompson healthy and to learn that her instincts about the case had been correct. But she was also glad that her life was returning to some semblance of normalcy. Agent Thompson, I'm just glad you survived and that the truth came out, Sarah replied. I hope your future assignments are safer. Actually, I have some news about that, Thompson said. I'm being reassigned to investigate corruption in civilian healthcare systems. Your case showed us that medical professionals can be crucial allies in exposing wrongdoing, and we want to work more closely with healthcare workers in future investigations. The irony that Sarah's experience would lead to closer cooperation between federal investigators and healthcare workers wasn't lost on her. Her ordeal had begun with a simple medical decision, but it had evolved into something that might help protect other healthcare workers in the future. 1 year after the night that changed her life, Sarah received a letter from the Department of Health and Human Services recognizing her contribution to exposing healthcare-related fraud and corruption. The letter commended her professional integrity and courage under difficult circumstances. More importantly to Sarah, she had returned to doing what she loved most, providing excellent patient care in the emergency room. Her experience had given her a deeper appreciation for the importance of trusting professional instincts and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The case had taught her that sometimes the most ordinary actions, like adjusting an IV line or questioning suspicious circumstances, can have extraordinary consequences. She had learned that being a healthcare professional meant more than just treating patients. It meant being willing to protect them from all threats, even those that came from unexpected sources. As Sarah continued her work at Mercy General, she often thought about the lessons learned from her experience. She had discovered that courage wasn't about seeking out heroic situations, but about doing the right thing when circumstances demanded it, regardless of the personal cost. The shocking twist that Lieutenant Commander Thompson was actually a federal agent had ultimately made Sarah's role in the case even more significant. Her medical expertise had helped protect a crucial federal investigation, and her willingness to speak the truth had helped bring dangerous criminals to justice. Looking back, Sarah realized that the night she saved Jake Thompson's life had been a turning point not just for him, but for her own understanding of what it meant to be a healthcare professional. She had learned that sometimes saving one life can help save many others, and that the courage to do what's right can have consequences far beyond anything anyone might imagine. The young nurse who had been fired for saving a Navy SEAL's life had become a symbol of professional integrity and courage. Her story would continue to inspire healthcare workers and federal investigators alike, proving that sometimes the most shocking twists in life come from the simple decision to do what's right, regardless of the consequences.